Great. Thank you so much, Annie. Really appreciate it. Yes, so welcome everyone. I am gonna quickly maybe check in with, maybe we might need to rethink these breakout rooms, and depending on how many people show up. So co-chairs, if you could help me think about that in the interim. But let's go ahead and get started, because we do have a presentation and some stuff to start us off. So we'll start there and then maybe think about how we want to work when we get there. So please do add your name to the document. I think everyone's probably used to that by now, but if you could go ahead and put your names and affiliation in there, that would be great, so we can know who's been here. So yeah, I want to welcome everyone to the session. The goals for this session are to provide an update about current status and future of the biological data standards cluster, and develop best practices related to the Make Your Data Software Ready section of the primer. And then, so I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Abby Benson. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm node manager for the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, the U.S. node to those. And I'm also the chair of the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster. So let's see, Laura, do you want to go next and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Laura Brinskelly. I have a PhD in biodiversity informatics from the University of Florida, where I worked closely with the Florida Museum of Natural History. So that's my background. Currently, I am a contractor at NOAA's National Center of Environmental Information.
Great, thanks so much, Laura, and really excited to have you join us as a co-chair. Steve, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I think I know most of the people here, but for those that don't, I work with Abby at USGS in the Science Analytics and Synthesis program, helping to manage GBIF and OBIS. And just generally thinking about species observation data. And then I'm also one of the co-chairs of this group.
Great, thanks so much, Steve. Tim?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Vanderstap. I am with the Haka Institute here on the west coast of Canada. With the Haka Institute, I wear two different hats. I'm both a salmon biologist in the field, as well as helping with data mobilization and management internally, as well as through external collaboration. So this cluster is a perfect crossroads of those two worlds, and so happy to be here.
Awesome, thanks so much, Tim. And last but not least, Kyla, our ESIP community fellow, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. My name is Kyla, and I am the ESIP community fellow. I'm working on finishing my master's in Hawaii on genetic diversity in seagrasses.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyla. Okay. So next up is a presentation that we have about, kind of where the cluster has been and where we're going in the future. And then we'll kind of talk about the breakouts that we want to do after that. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can folks see that okay? Okay, thanks, yep. Annie. All right, great. So the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster, yeah, we introduced ourselves. I did want to take a brief moment to thank Robert McGuinn, who has been one of the co-chairs of this cluster since the beginning. I couldn't have done this without him. He's really provided so much input and guidance on this cluster. He's stepping down as co-chair, but I wanted to take a minute and thank him for all of his input on where we are today. We couldn't have done it without him. So the problem that was identified at a workshop that happened in 2020 was basically the diversity of biological data and seeming lack of overarching excuse me, community standards makes working with biological data challenging. Oh, give me a second, sorry. It's that morning thing. So there are standards that do exist for biological data, but it can be hard to find them, hard to know how to apply them, when to apply them or not. And so we felt that the biological data community in the US and in Canada too, could benefit from guidance, best practice documentation, training, and community building. Early on with the cluster, we did a Slido poll and asked how this cluster will be successful. And I think these are some of the answers that really highlight what this cluster can do. So basically increasing awareness and adoption of biological data standards, enhancing widespread interest in them, getting more people to be aware and using these standards, providing clear guidance to someone who's new to them and doesn't really know how to apply them, and then becoming a clearinghouse for that guidance. So our goal is to maximize data relevance and utility for understanding changes in biodiversity over time. Kind of a big goal, but hopefully, working with standards helps make that possible. Going back to that Slido poll, so there's some answers to a Slido poll, that same one that I just referenced a few slides ago. These were some low-hanging fruit that were identified at the workshop that was held in 2020. So we took those and we asked the cluster, which one should we tackle first? We ended up deciding to try to do a decision tree. That was much harder than we had anticipated. So we ended up developing the primer, which maybe someone can link to that in the chat for me. So that primer was basically just a quick summary, trying to get people initially introduced to the idea of standards. But really what people had selected most was to create a best practice document for required, recommended, optional information for different standards. So that's kind of where we're going to be heading next, spoiler alert. And so we reviewed, the co-chairs and I reviewed all the input that had been provided over the past couple of years from the cluster on Jamboards and various ways of getting feedback. And we settled on basically these community generated themes that we were seeing of increasing awareness and interest in standards, creating a unity or shared vision around biological data standards and implementation, and providing guidance, and providing opportunities for knowledge sharing and coordination. There's definitely a lot of people wanted to see us coordinating with other ESIP clusters and making sure that that's happening, and then provide connectivity across ESIP. So based on that, we've refined the cluster goals a little bit to help people choose which standards to use, provide an education aspect to what we're doing, and then get collective agreement buy-in among data managers and existing agencies or organizations on what are the best practices. So we feel like this will be a really great way to come together as a community to, solidify what we think are the best practices. So even just discussing these things in our group, aside from the products at the end, will be a really valuable experience. We see the audience for this as someone who's in a new data manager role or someone who's new to managing biological data. To be able to see, the landscape of, standards for biological data, and it's clear how they can fit in, where they should be applying standards or not, and what the options are out there for them for the data that they're working with. So basically what we want to do is extend the usefulness of the primer. The primer is a great start for this cluster in trying to spread awareness, but it really doesn't help you with selecting which standards you should apply to your data. So we wanted to create a way that would help people with that, with picking which standards to use, identifying how to apply them, or getting some more references on how to do that. And so we think creating a modular suite of best practice documents for the different sections of the primer will help with that, we hope. And so we kind of created a template for how we want to document this information. And we're starting with the Make Your Data Software Ready section of the primer to start building these best practice documents. The Make Your Data Software Ready section of the primer includes use non-proprietary formats, structure data in tidy long format, follow ISO 8601 for dates, match scientific names to a taxonomic authority, record latitude and longitude in decimal degrees in WGS 84, and use globally unique identifiers. So those are the topics that we will be talking about today. So the brainstorming exercise that we wanted to do, we've done it in the cluster, and we wanted to bring what we've done in the cluster to you all, and then get your feedback on what we have so far, help us with figuring out what's missing or what we might need to add or modify language, things like that. So there will be information already in the documents, and we're looking to you to figure out, does it make sense? Are there things missing? Do we need to make it clearer? So what we had planned on was to do 6 breakout rooms and for each of these topics, but it may be worth like stepping away from this and kind of discussing that a bit. So let me stop sharing and bring you all back up. Yeah. I'm wondering if we might change what we're going to do, because I don't think we have enough people here that would warrant 6 breakout rooms.
Abby, what about, since you were going to do 2 sessions, would you want to do the first 3 and then the next 3? Like start off.
We could do it.
I would be open for other, if you all have other suggestions as well. I could reconfigure the rooms anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of a small group, and those of us leading have already provided input. I guess I'm wondering if we should maybe just go through them one by one with everyone that's here.
Kind of what I was thinking as well. Sorry.
That's what I was thinking too.
Okay.
I think going through, but if I understood Annie right, were you saying that we just focus on the first 3 in the first sort of session, breakout session, and then the last 3 in the second session? Is that what you're saying, Annie?
I guess so, but I think I'm also fine if you didn't want to actually break out. And Abby, were you saying everyone just stays together and you can go through them?
Yeah, because I think we, the ratio would just be, would probably end up with people not in breakout rooms or something along those lines. So I think, or, a breakout room with just a lead in it, which I don't know how well that would work. So I think going through them one by one, and since Matt and Laura kind of agree, maybe we'll just do that. So everyone gets to stay here. You get to provide your input on each one. So let me bring those up so I have them ready.
Abby, do you want to put a time limit on how long we spend on each one, or the first 3 or something like that?
I think that's a good idea.
Yes. What should we do?
I can watch the clock. I can be the timekeeper.
What time should we apply to it, do you think?
See, we have 1 hour and 15 minutes left. Is that right?
Yes.
I think so. And
Yep.
there's
So 10 minutes per bullet. And then that gives us 15 minutes at the end.
Okay. Yep, that sounds good. Okay. All right. And for anyone who wants to, sorry, I should have mentioned this, but under the resources for this section of the document, there are links to each of these. There's individual Google documents for each of these topics. So I'm going to bring them up so we can all look at the same thing, but you're welcome to hop in. And we'll start with the first one, which is use non-proprietary formats. Are there any questions before we do this about what we're doing or about the cluster or anything like that? Okay. Let's see. Okay. So, let's go away. There we go. All right. So the first one we want to talk about is use non-proprietary formats. So what we want to do is review the content that's here, that's been provided so far, provide any changes to the language, or identify things that might be missing. So how about I give everyone like a minute or two to read over what's here, and then we'll discuss any updates or changes. So at 9:20, I'll check back in. 9:20 my time. 20 minutes, that's the hour. Okay, does anyone need more time to read through this?
No, that was good. And I'm actually glad we're all doing it. I'm like seeing things again now with fresh eyes. So I think it'll be good.
Great. Okay, so any comments? Matt, I see you added that it ensures accessibility. I think that's a good addition. Anything else that anyone sees on this topic? Yeah, Madison.
Yeah, I added this down below to anything missing, but I think it would be really useful to kind of make it very clear for users, like providing some examples. Like here's an example of a proprietary format that's commonly used for biological data. And then here's a good alternative for that that has similar capabilities and kind of works with the same types of tools or something like that to really bring it home for folks.
Yeah.
So sort of like a crosswalk between proprietary and non-proprietary formats.
Yeah, but I don't know that it has to be necessarily comprehensive. That might be challenging to do, but at least providing a single example might be useful.
I like that.
Madison, I'm curious, did you get a chance to look at that link to the Ohio State University library?
No, I didn't.
Take a look at that. It doesn't provide like a crosswalk exactly or like a side-by-side comparison, but it is one of the more comprehensive lists we could find. Because one of the problems is that, you know, of course, there's extensions that are redundant across, you know, what are they called? Fields. And so meaning like, I've seen websites that try to like tackle everything like, oh, this extension always means this type of file, and therefore you should use something else. And it just can get that type of task can get really bloated really fast, you know, to try to crosswalk everything or the most pertinent things. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long way of saying, I think the Ohio State table is pretty good for providing examples.
This looks great. I guess I was thinking like specifically, and maybe this doesn't exist, or maybe you all don't know of it, but like if there is an example like specifically for biological data, where like, you know, we understand like this software or something, you know, creates data in this proprietary format. Here's how you can overcome that. And it's like, that would be meaningful to have like on your best practices guide, just like one, and then linking to this would be helpful. Because as a user, I tend not to click into the references, honestly, even though they're probably really helpful.
I think maybe just talking about the most common one I could possibly think of is just the Excel versus CSV. I think that could be one to drop in. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Annie?
That's just what I was going to ask, if there was a glaring example of that. I mean, just yesterday I read, it was like a Medium article that was like 5 great open source alternatives that you didn't know. And it was just kind of a tongue in cheek. But I was like, ooh, I'm going to read that and figure out what they're talking about. So I wonder if there was, in your community, what I would say most common offenders are. And maybe if it's just Excel or something else, but yeah, just kind of figuring out what the most common one would be.
Yeah, I think it would be the Microsoft ones like Access and Excel and stuff like that. And when you were saying that, Annie, I was thinking that could be an opportunity to make something, to bring in a little bit of fun or flair maybe to this document, and have like a little inset or something that's like, hey, here's some other things you might consider instead of, so Matt.
Yeah, I would just along these lines, it would be nice to include an example of like, this is what happens if, because I've had it in the case where I've opened an Excel file and like data has been missing, and I went and I actually opened it up with Excel and it was there, and so there was a translation error issue. And so showing that example of like, if the data set stored as a CSV, you get what you get, but if it's as an Excel, here's an example of where you actually lose information because you're using that format.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, to me, is the balance between trying to provide enough information that it's easily digestible, but still makes it useful for people. So, when might we go over, make it too long, basically, for people. I don't know what that balance is, and I'm interested to hear what people think. Is it Andrew? I don't know your first name, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'll change that. I'm Andrew. I think the section where it's defining what non-proprietary format is, and you give the example of XML, would be a good place to actually use the CSV versus Microsoft, because I think there's a lot of graduate students that don't know what XML is. But if you explain the CSV is non-proprietary and the Excel spreadsheet isn't, that would be more clear to them what you're trying to do, instead of giving them an example of a file they might not have even heard of before.
Yeah, makes sense.
So we've got just about 1 minute left. I did want to say, Gary, I see your comment in the chat about, adding costs. And I'm curious if you could just add in maybe some text about that.
Yeah, I mean, because I think we tried to maybe tackle that here. Does it not do a good enough job?
Well, I'm sure the cost was mentioned elsewhere in the document, but not when we had the specific section on what a non-proprietary was. And it seems to me there's multiple reasons why you would not use a proprietary one. It's not because it's just secret. It could be secret. That could be enough. It could be it's hard for the interface for an API. It could be for it's requires other software, or it actually requires an expense to use. So
Sure.
It seems to me that the proprietary section there just needed to have a few more things said.
Okay. Yeah. Do you mind adding that in? Would that be okay? Like maybe as a comment or something?
Since I wasn't part of the original people who wrote this, I was deferring to people who might have a sensitivity, but I can certainly add some language. I also did edit a few other parts of the document. I think while I have the floor here for a moment, we might say a little bit more about FAIR principles, which sort of, rather than the whole idea of findability, accessibility, and so forth, there are certain principles about using like standard vocabularies, non-proprietary vocabularies, that could also maybe be mentioned in the document here. It may be, you may have that in another place, but it could be mentioned here.
Okay. Yeah. If you could add that as a comment, that would be great. All right. We have to move on to the next one. So the next one is to structure data in tidy long format. And I will say that this one kind of is the most confusing one. Maybe I'm going out on a limb there, but I think it's the one we've struggled with a bit. So I'll give people a chance, another couple minutes to read through it, and then we'll discuss it. Okay. See, Furious commenting and typing, which is great. Do people need a couple more minutes?
I think in the interest of time, we should just keep going. We have about 7.5 minutes left. Meaning
Sure.
like just go ahead and get started and, people can stand back
Yeah.
if needed.
I have a quick, more general question.
Sure.
Do these recommendations apply equally to both data and metadata, or do they really kind of lean more into one over the other?
That's a good question. In my mind, they apply more to data, but I would be interested to hear what other people think.
I mean, I think some of these might apply to metadata, but some of it is more data focused, like the scientific names one and that type stuff. Like some of it's more granular than you get in metadata, really.
Yeah.
I guess that's true, but at the same time, I think one of the examples that we showed in the previous topic was the topic of XML, which is more geared, I feel like, towards metadata. So I feel like it brushes on both data as well as metadata with a slight, maybe leaning a little bit more towards the data side, but I feel like the best practices document can touch on both aspects.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it might be worth, can I bring it up easily? The primer might be worth just sort of highlighting that there's like a metadata section to the primer and a data standard section of the primer, and then some control vocabulary. And where we're at is this section, this make your data software ready. So, other best practices like the one that we would develop for metadata would be specifically focused to that. I don't know if that helps.
It does. Sorry, I hadn't had a chance to jump into the primer.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Something that I see now is I feel like the alternative to a tidy set of data, especially with regards to community data, isn't well described. The idea of a community matrix is a pretty, standard idea, at least in the ecology world. And so maybe focusing some text on that idea of like, this is a community matrix, which we use for a lot of convenient biological math, but for purposes of sharing and archiving, sometimes a tidier format is, more appropriate.
Yeah, Madison, and I see, Gary, you have a question in the chat, so I'll get that next.
And I just wanted to second something that somebody put down below, which is like this would lend itself very well to graphics, like to a visual example. So you could have like, this is what a community matrix looks like, and here's what it looks like in a tidy format.
Yeah, makes sense. And Gary asked in the chat, are we considering linked data as part of structured data?
Partly a response to the topic, the way it's described as structured data and there's lots of ways of structuring data. Linked data is one example. It relates to, you can capture a tabular idea in it, but it isn't necessarily a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
The question is scope here.
I think structure here was meant as a verb, but you're right, it's not clear. So there's an opportunity to be clearer here in what we mean.
Or you're limiting it to tabular, and that may be a good, that may be what you want to do.
Yes.
You might change the title then.
Yes. Good call. I'm going to, someone else will add that in for me. Thanks. Yes, I think that's smart, and that would amend the primer, but I think that's great that this is highlighting ways we need to make changes to the primer as well. Okay, anything else on this one?
added I had a question about the key information, the last bullet. It says don't put metadata in the top of your spreadsheet, but I was curious if, was that hinting at the fact of like the example that I put in there where you have like each column is a different year, and instead take all that out and say there's a column for year and then there's data values in there. So you're taking the column headers out and making those actual data values. Is that what that point was hinting at, or did I miss that topic?
I think so. If you've ever seen the way that biologists sometimes capture their data in a spreadsheet, they will sometimes have like sometimes they format it like their data sheet where they have their name sort of at the top. And so I think it's kind of referring to stuff like that, where there's like a bunch of like 5 lines of stuff that's metadata that's like at the top, that's not structured. It's not like NetCDF or something where it's logically structured, but instead it's just sort of like you're using a spreadsheet like it's a Word document kind of. I think it's towards that, but I didn't put that in. I don't think so. I don't know.
Matt, I think I may have put that in, and the example that sprung to mind was I was working with a stomach fullness, stomach content data set, and in the column header it said stomach fullness, and it is like 0 equals empty, 1 equals partially full, etc. But that 0 equals empty, 1 equals partially full should not be in the should not be in the column header. That should be either in a separate data dictionary or in a separate file. So that's what I consider metadata. The metadata to explain what the content of that column is. I hope that makes sense. To further explain the content of that column.
Okay, that does make sense. Okay, I guess, yeah, so my suggestion might be an additional bullet to split out information, because from switching from that long format or wide to the long format.
I have one more comment, and I apologize, y'all. I can't find the raise hand button on my screen, but maybe I'm using the online version. Maybe that's why. But my comment is that maybe, you know, in hearing these comments, it makes me think that this is sort of more like it's important that you be aware of this structure and be able to put your data, get your data into the structure if needed. Not so much that like this is the best thing always, but just that like it's, you know, an important tool to have in your toolkit is to be able to easily convert your data to the structure when it is the best structure to use.
That makes sense, Steve. And I see we're out of time, but I think, Andrew, I saw you on mute. Did you want to add something? And Steve, I think you can't raise your hand because you're a co-host. Co-hosts lose that privilege.
I'm just going to add it into the document. I was just going to agree with Tim, so we're good.
Okay. Okay, great. All right, so topic 3. So follow ISO 8601 for dates. I kind of hope that this is everyone here is like fully on board with this. And if we could just get everyone in the world to just do this all the time, I think we would all be better off. That's my own personal opinion. Anyways, I'll give you a moment to read what's here and then we'll discuss. Oh, okay. Laura, you can raise your hand. Maybe it is a browser versus, sorry, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, go ahead, Laura.
I think this is more of a question than anything, which may or may not lead to something added to this. How does this work for things in geologic time, or is that applicable? I don't know that much about ISO 8601, to be frank. So
good question.
I should know this because time is like my thing, but I don't know.
I don't know how ISO handles geologic time, to be honest, since I don't really work in geologic time. Does anyone know here?
There is, I think on the Wikipedia page, it talks about it. I don't remember off the top of my head because I never have to, you know, use it, but I think it does go into the details there.
Do they standardize geological time to Zulu?
I think so, but maybe I'm wrong. To be honest, I shouldn't talk. I don't know anything about geological time.
Yeah, I don't know. I just was wondering because I feel like this is for biological data managers that can also incorporate paleontologists and zooarchaeologists, things like that. So I feel like that would be a question people might have.
Yeah, definitely. I
We
think, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Maybe we need to look it up and figure out if that question comes up, how to do that. So
I think that they do it completely differently. Like I'll throw in a reference that we have at USGS to like handling geologic time. And I just think it would be handled completely differently. Like it would be a different, you wouldn't mix current time with geologic time. I don't think. I'm also not an expert in this.
and to be clear, I
Yeah,
don't
there are
mean
various granularities to time, and some ontologies take on those granularities too.
So to be clear, I don't mean like the geologic time scale of like the Paleozoic. I mean like 52 million years from present or something like that. That's more what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that we should figure out. We should add a bullet for it. So if you haven't put it in, Laura, you should put it in.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thanks. Okay. I see some links in the chat. Should we add, are those links to be added to here? Just kind of reference for what we're saying right now.
Yeah, the link that I put in was just the calendar that the ISO standard is based off of, and so that might get you into how to do geological time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Any-
so sorry.
Go ahead.
I found in the Wikipedia, if you go to the Wikipedia of the ISO 8601, here I'll put it in the chat. If you go to the years section, it describes, it doesn't sound like there's necessarily actually one clear standard, but that there are ways to represent years after 9,999 and then years before 0. So there are conventions, but it sounds like other parts of ISO 8601, you know, depending on your needs, you can do it maybe one or two different ways.
Okay.
So are you recommending that they correct to UTC rather than saying their plus or minus time zone from UTC? Or are either of those acceptable?
Either are acceptable with ISO 8601, and I think that's the bottom line. I think for purposes, I tend to just as a data manager try to get people to put their time into UTC, just so, you know, remove sort of one point of ambiguity or potential ambiguity. But for the purposes of ISO, either is acceptable.
As long as you're explicitly stating the time zone or the offset.
Exactly.
I put in a comment under the Y for climate and forecast. I thought of this last night. I was taking a look at the CF documentation, and it actually ISO 8601 isn't referenced for climate and forecast. They recommend UD units, and UD units is like second since 1970 or a duration since a specific year. But then what happens is when you represent that using whatever package, they'll build that into ISO 8601 or whatever date format you want to use. So I don't know if that's worth noting, that nuance.
Yeah, that definitely is. Thanks, Matt. I didn't realize that. I think I'm guilty of just assuming that, you know, when it came out of my computer looking like ISO, I just assumed that's what it was on the inside, you know?
Yeah, it took me, I was in agreement with you, and then I was like, wait, hold on, let me let me look this up and actually dig into the documentation.
Yeah, it makes sense. Matt, can you add to your comment what you said about UD? I might not, but can you add to that information that you provided so that, because it sounds like we either need to decide, I mean, we could just take climate and forecast out as an example, if that's not true, or do something else. But maybe with that information that you provided about what it does actually do, we could make a decision.
Yeah, I put a bunch of information in that comment.
Ah, I see. I don't have it. Yes, thank you. Aha, there it is. Appreciate it. Sorry.
So Matt, pardon my ignorance here, but how does ERDA deal with data that's from before this 1992? Would that?
So what I pasted in there is an example. The specification just says you need to have a unit. It could be seconds, it could be days. It's a unit, since, and a year that's in a ISO format. So it could be seconds since 1970. I think that's the standard one that like Unix time is based off of. This example, I don't know why they use such a weird time for their example, but the idea is your data is stored as seconds, and then your units help you define where that seconds are aligned to.
Gotcha. Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, we got to keep moving along. So the next one is match scientific names to a taxonomic authority. So we'll give everyone a minute to read what's here, and then we'll discuss. Okay. Gary, I see your question. Could we add a controlled vocabulary authority to the topic name? I'm not sure where.
So it broadens the idea of taxonomy, which is a structure, but if you're matching scientific names, then there are controlled vocabularies that are used, and that's also a good source. So partly it's a question of, is it just a matter of the naming issue, or is it the structuring issue? So the taxonomy has a structuring issue, but the controlled vocabulary has relevance to the names.
Gary, could you give us an example of an unstructured one? I'm not sure that
Well, I wonder if the issue is that by taxonomic here, we mean specifically scientific name taxonomy and not, because I think taxonomy means something different in the ESIP world.
True. Good call.
So I guess I'm wondering, Gary, if that's the issue. So here, when we say a taxonomic authority, we specifically mean an authority that manages the biological scientific name, taxa names.
Yes, I see. I'm thinking it's in UMLS, Uniform Medical Language, which is sort of a mixture of taxonomies and vocabularies. I think I understand where you're coming from. Within the bio realm, the taxonomic authority means something different than it does in the semantic resource, the broader semantic resource community.
Yes. Yes. And so I think for the people we would be targeting for this would hopefully not be confusing, but I can see that it could be confusing here in ESIP.
Aren't there a lot of people in the OBO realm? The OBO Foundry that would be looking at this too?
Well, so, okay, going back again to the primer, there is a section for controlled vocabularies, which taxonomic authorities is one. So here, if you go there, you can click these links and you can see what we are trying to say by a taxonomic authority. And we do have controlled vocabulary. So this is a specific section of the primer that we will eventually hopefully develop a best practice for. But this this sort of what am I trying to say? Need or whatever that we're saying is specific to like genus species.
Is there, I haven't looked at the links, I haven't gone through them. Is there a place that you reference to what taxonomic authority means within this context?
Yeah, good question. I think we put something in here?
You can find it in Wikipedia, for example. A taxonomy comes up, but not taxonomic authority. I'm
Yeah,
just
we
wondering
struggled
where
with
a good
this.
source on this is.
That last bullet under why, I think, was what we sort of landed on. But yeah, we couldn't find some, authoritative definition.
I think one issue with this is that the biological community as a whole is kind of, I mean, you've got like taxonomic authorities and papers and literature, but I don't think that there's really, I mean, we have some examples of usually domain specific databases of what scientific names are, but there's no overarching place to go look up what a scientific name specifically means in like a citable way that gives you a URL. Sorry, my dog is getting antsy. So it's sort of an evolving practice.
Yeah, I looked at the third link under the references, and that sort of takes me not to a taxonomic thing, but to a name thing. So again, it sort of brings me almost back to this idea of controlled vocabulary. What do you want to call things? And this is a name resolver. So, I mean, that's why there may be a little bit of confusion here about what you're pointing to.
I think also another thing is that it's very hard to have a controlled vocabulary of scientific like species names because they are ever evolving and changing. They can get collapsed, they can get expanded, they can be changing all the time. So it's really hard to make a database that has a controlled vocabulary of scientific names because they're not set in stone. So
Your example would be the World Register of Marine Species. That's an example of an authority.
yes, a citable one where you could put like a link to an ID of what you mean by a specific species.
So maybe a link to that would be useful.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Madison?
I wonder if category, like having, instead of just under references, maybe, even though you do have it in the primer, having another little section on taxonomic authorities and the links to each one, like that you guys call out in the primer.
Yeah.
And then like under the references, kind of some context around what each of those references is supposed to be, like to indicate maybe this isn't a taxonomic authority, but this might help you do whatever. That like, yeah, I don't know what the global names thing is.
Yeah.
Getting the idea of classification. I guess that word could be used also. Is what you're trying to do. You're trying to classify things.
Yeah, we do have that in the definition I highlighted. That's in bullet 3 under Y, that it's a classification of species. Steve?
So I do want to point out, too, that I think, our purpose in creating this, though, is as a more practical goal of saying, in my lab, like we call this grass Spartina alterniflora. Other labs, other people in the world call it Sporobolus alterniflora. So therefore, how do I get from like the name that I use and the reasons I use it to these other names so that I can put my data in these places and make it interoperable with other people? I mean, I think that's, at least for me, in the language, like the text we're trying to construct here, that's the point, is not find like the perfect taxonomy, but rather just say, have a reason for using what you use, and then make sure you can get from there to the other places that people find useful.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, any other thoughts?
Maybe just calling out that that is your definition could also be helpful. Like under Y?
So like,
saying-
you mean like this?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's an easy add. Okay. Let's move on to the next one, which is record latitude and longitude in decimal degrees in WGS 84. And I think, so I'll let people read this, but I think maybe it's worth noting that this is not like a rule, because I think that somehow, maybe when people were discussing this before, you know, it's not like everything has to be in that, it's just sort of a suggestion of how to make your data interoperable in a way, so.
I actually have a question, maybe Matt. I'll ask you since you brought up CF before. To be honest, the CF standard is confusing to me. The definition, I have trouble understanding if there is a unit implicit in it or not. I don't think there is, or rather I think it's degrees, but then they sort of are ambiguous about any precision beyond degrees. Do you know, Matt, for sure, what's the CF standard?
Yeah, it's decimal degrees north and decimal degrees east. And that's for the, that's so again, this is they reference to UD units. And UD units has a units of degrees north. So sorry, decimal degrees is degrees north. That makes sense.
But what about, okay, but it says the recommended unit, right? So it's not like, it doesn't have to be, correct? Like, and I think that was sort of my problem, is realizing that you don't, I've seen a lot of like NetCDF files that, you know, for latitude and longitude don't name a unit. And so I guess that's implicit, but.
Well, so if they don't name a unit, then they have a standard name of latitude, then they're not aligning with CF, so they're not CF compliant.
So the unit for CF should be, that's interesting, because I've seen a lot of things that say they're CF compliant, but miss that unit. Good to know.
Yeah, that's a matter of how many people are actually testing their compliance against the standard. And since you're not uploading it to an IPT or something that actually evaluates its standard, you're just sharing it out, and people are assuming that if you say my convention is equal to CF 1.10, then all of the things will align to that standard.
Cool. I think that's a bit of a deep dive on NetCDF. So any thoughts on this, Madison? I see that you added that, so there's good conversation happening there. Any questions or anything anyone has on this one or what we have so far?
I guess I do have a question just overall. So if you are not like collecting the data in WGS 84, but then you're not doing your analysis on that, like, are we saying just collect your data that way? Or I mean, I don't know, are there implications when you're not collecting data and that, like, in that format and analyzing it that way, and then you share it that way? Does that like affect results, or like, I don't know. I guess I'm struggling with what my question is there.
I think I maybe understand. So if your coordinates like are not in WGS 84 and you're using someone else's data that is, then the points on the globe are not going to be in the same place. Like, it might be the same location, but it's not going to be in the same location because you're using different coordinate systems. So, and it's very complicated because there's also projections. And so, you know, WGS 84 is an unprojected coordinate system, but your data could be projected. Like if you're in the Arctic, you might want to project it to the Arctic. Anyways, so it's just, if you are not careful about that, then your latitude and longitude is not going to be accurate in comparison to other data. Does that help?
I think so, yeah. I guess I was thinking, is it important to call out implications for transforming data from, or maybe even saying that, like having a description of like, here's why it matters. Like if you're trying to integrate data and you're, you know, it may look like they're the same, but they might not be, or I don't know. This is one of my unknown areas. So.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Matt?
I've seen someone before give a presentation that talked about precision, and there's a note at the bottom, but they actually had a really cool graphic that said like, here's the point if it's 1 decimal place, here's the point if it's 3 decimal places, and kind of gives you like, you're just talking about the country, now you're just talking about the state, now you're actually talking about the street, now you're talking about the ant walking on the street. And so having that kind of a depiction of precision would be nice to include here.
Did we not have that XKCD comic in here? I thought we did.
No, it's not. It's in our workshop stuff.
Oh.
Anyways, so
but yes, Matt. Yeah, we were. Yeah, that would be at least funny to include for sure.
Yes, Andrew.
I think along those lines, a user could have a device that's giving them 8 decimal points, but that's only accurate if they do the proper correction. So some language about just because your instrument's giving you 8 decimals doesn't mean you know 8 decimals of information.
Yes, which I think, so I linked to this XKCD comic, which I think is basically tongue-in-cheek trying to point that out. Like, just because your computer will give you down to, you know, really, really precise, it doesn't mean, like, that's basically impossible. Your level of precision is impossible that you're reporting here. So I think people just don't think about it or aren't aware. So I think it is worth calling out.
Is this a point oriented approach to location, or do you consider the idea of a region being located and expressing that some way? So a site might have an extent as opposed to being one particular point down to a decimal. And is that important to capture too?
Yeah, good question. I know that like in Darwin Core, for instance, there is a way to capture a footprint. So that is possible to do. I don't know if we need to include that here. That's a good question.
You might want to make a comment saying that you're not including it here or something like that, that people understand.
Yeah.
That it's beyond the scope of what you're trying to do here.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Gary, are you talking about well-known text or something else? Or you're not?
No, I think I was being just abstract as opposed to thinking of a particular thing. I mean, I do know of some efforts. Again, I'm more in the ontological space, so people are trying to formalize things broadly, and so there's efforts to describe regions as well as points.
Gotcha, because I think well-known text still works as long as it's in decimal degrees, you know, same idea, just you can express a footprint.
Right, expressing a footprint would be useful.
Yeah, I guess what Steve's saying is we think that's still possible in decimal degrees in WGS 84. So that this still applies to both things.
And maybe that's worth noting because I hadn't thought about it, but that, you know, whether you're talking about a polygon or a point still applies.
Yes.
Or a line, polyline, yeah.
Right.
Most of it reads as if it's a point. Most of it reads as if it's a point, but you want to make sure that you can use this approach for regions too.
Yeah. Okay, that's worth thinking about. Yeah, we need to move on to the next one. So the last one we have is to use globally unique identifiers, which I know is something I attended the samples session earlier this week, and they're thinking about this too. So I think it would be great if we can match up with what they're doing, if that's possible. But anyways, I'll let you all read what's here, and then we can discuss it. Yeah. Do we want to say they are linkable? I think.
You mean that so you can find them and access them. So you have the ID, but then you have a link behind that so that you go to where it is, where the data is.
Yeah. I think in some cases for biological data, that's not possible. So I don't know that we could, I think we could suggest that if there is a linkable one, to provide it. So for instance, that's what we would do with the taxonomic names, with the taxonomic authorities, is, you know, provide the URI to the name that you are using. But I don't think that would be possible for like every specimen in every museum currently.
Yeah, I think we can put it as a, if you have it and it's possible, do it. Kind of like related to the sample talk. I think it was in the sample session where we talked about what's possible now and what could be, you know, the forward looking future of ideal that we want to reach to, type thing. Just have that as a recommendation.
Yeah, for sure. Andrew, I see your question. I don't think, I mean, there are some methods that people use. So there's the Darwin Core triplet, or whatever it's called, where you concatenate collection and catalog number, and what else? Laura, do you know?
Oh, I just looked it up the other day.
I think there is also like a global way where you identify like a 128-bit identifier with I think numbers 1 to 9 and letters A to F, and it's unique for sure. Is it usable? That'll be a different question, I think, altogether.
Yeah, because there's also occurrence IDs that sound like similar to what Tim's saying too in Darwin Core.
Yeah, so I guess where I could see a researcher getting confused by this is, say there's a graduate student goes out and collects 2,000 plant samples, and then they read this document and they're like, do I need to assign an identifier for all 2,000 of my plant samples, or do I just put them into a single database, a data set, and get a DOI for the data set? I could see how someone would be confused as to what exactly they're supposed to be doing here.
Sure. Yeah, and we would advise to give all 2,000 a unique identifier.
And maybe also all of them could give them a reliquary.
Right, harking back to the session from earlier this week. So if you weren't in that one, that might not make sense, but reliquary was new to me. But yeah, Madison?
So maybe adding something like, not just like if it already exists, use it, but like if you are collecting the data, consider generating a unique identifier for each, for every sample.
Yes, globally unique, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to
Correct.
2,000. I just qualify. Yes. Maybe that is what we need to add here.
So when I think about a GUID, I'm thinking of a process or a framework that allows me to assign that. So it's not that the GUID exists ahead of time, it's that a framework or an approach exists, and then I assign it but using that, right?
A framework or an approach exists.
Because yeah, the GUID doesn't necessarily exist ahead of time,
No.
gather a sample, then we say, okay, so how are we gonna identify this? And
Mhm.
I'm gonna use this approach, and I'm gonna go to this authority that allows me to do that.
Look through this authority that allows me to do that. That's the part that I don't think exists for much biological data. You're kind of out doing it on your own. And for the most part, I think what people do, they do sort of, you have a database, you have probably, you know, each row in your database is uniquely identified, but it's not globally unique. So it's unique within your database. But if you were to put that data out into the world, it might have the same GUID as someone else, because you might not be considering, you know, how to make it globally unique.
That sounds right, but when I read under why, the first bullet, I don't necessarily get that idea.
Yeah, sure. I think because when we wrote that one, I think Stephen, Tim, and I wrote that one. You know, we were thinking about scientific names, for instance, where there is one existing in the world, or there could hopefully is one. So, you know, don't make up a unique identifier for a scientific name. Instead, use one that's in a taxonomic authority. But it gets tricky when your data is unique to you. So, Andrew?
Yeah, so is there a way to generate these or to know if your ID is globally unique?
There is, so we do, didn't we include it? Okay, so there's an R package UUID, that's the first reference there. You can create globally unique identifiers using that R package. And it's just a matter of maintaining them then. So if you create it for a sample, then you need to maintain that. You know, you need to always have that linked to that sample. And that there are efforts there's interest to try to create like similar to the IGSN for biological data, but it doesn't exist yet that I know of.
So IGSNs they're expanding so that they're hoping that biological samples will use them, I believe. So that might be something worth adding, like check if your institution has the capability for assigning DOIs and IGSNs. And then also, I just wanted to make kind of an overarching plug for like adding, I think I said this to one of the other ones, but like for all of the references section, providing context for what links are, because I will rarely click on a link if I don't know where it's gonna, what I'm supposed to be learning there.
That's a great feedback. Thank you. Yeah, we should do that for all of them. That's something we should check for all of them. Andrew, did you have more on that topic at all? Sorry, I feel like.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around this, and I don't know if I completely understand it. So if I'm going out to sample a plant in the world, is the ID for that plant in the world, or is it for every clipping of that plant I take? Say I take a clipping for DNA analysis and a clipping for ploidy analysis and a clipping for chemical analysis. Do each of those samples have a unique identifier, or does the plant have a unique identifier, or all the above?
Probably all the
above. If I'm going to take a sample and consume that sample and it's gone, it's a deconstructed sample. The sample has an identifier, but no one can use it. Like it's gone.
But there will still be data associated to that sample, right? I think.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this to make sure I'm understanding it. So my plant could possibly have a globally unique ID. Each sample I take from the plant could have a globally unique ID.
Ideally, you would tie them together. You would link them.
And then they'd all be nested and linked. Okay.
Yeah, Andrew, a place where that might help you understand that better is like where that really shines is when you're sharing a parent sample with other labs. You know, everybody goes out and takes one core, you know, uproots an entire plant, whatever, and then you divvy it up and everybody goes their own way. By having that identifier at the parent level, everybody's individual work can be linked back to that sampling event really easily.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I like this idea because I have a data set right now where the original sample was collected and identified, and then one of the agencies involved changed the name of the ID because they got new information. And so now there's 3 sets of IDs for the same plant. Like, I like the idea. I'm just trying to figure out how to sell it to researchers because it seems like a lot of extra work. It's going to save you time in the long run as you share data, but it's going to be some upfront work to get it done.
Yeah, that's a good point
So-
that we might want to identify why or how this is, why you want to do this better. If it's not there, if the why isn't grabbing people, then we maybe need to work on that some. But Laura, I know you've had your hand up a while.
I think on that note, I have something to say that's separate, but I just wanted to reply to that too. I've also heard from many a museum collection manager, like, I'm not putting like a QR code on all of my samples that links out. So yeah, that is definitely a thing that people say it's just too much work and there's not enough funding and all of that. But anyway, I wanted to say about this document broadly, maybe we should be more specific in the topic and say, use globally unique identifiers for your sample or specimen or whatever term we want to use, because it sort of bleeds into scientific name and other sorts of globally unique identifiers. And I'm not saying that those are bad ideas, but I think that it would help keep this one more concise and less confusing if it was just talking about one thing.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I also, I don't want people to think they should, like, if they only come to this one, I still want them to use globally unique identifiers for their scientific names. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
we should think about how to tackle that for sure.
Maybe break it up into separate sections or something to make it a little more clear, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. Gary?
I just wanted to note that in the bottom of our page here under is anything missing, one of the bullets use sample IGSN as that. So that's sort of imply, if we go with that missing, that implies that more than just the species name standardized, it's the sample too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we made it through all of them, which is really exciting. Thank you all so much for your input on these. I mean, feel free to keep providing more input on them. I'm going to go back to our yeah, we changed what we're doing a little bit. So I guess, yeah, any general feedback on this whole thing, since we went through it and you saw all the different ones?
I think one of the things that I've seen, not just in today's conversation, but as we've done this now a few times, is that these are just good conversations to be having in general. And maybe that idea is something we could promote as well, that like, maybe I guess that's what our group does, but right, that having these conversations helps you find that common ground, because it's obvious, we have a room of a dozen people and we all have nuanced visions and ideas of how these things should or could work. And by having those conversations, we're finding that common ground. And so I guess I'm not really saying anything except, yeah, this group is doing what it's supposed to do. So good.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, Andrew, let me write down, sadly, because I'm USGS, I can't use the mailing list, but you should add yourself to it anyways. It should be on our cluster collaboration area, our wiki. But I will add your name and your email if I can find it easily to I have a separate mailing list I have to keep, so I'll make sure to add you. So any other general comments? Yeah, Tim, I see yours to provide more context. It's hard, again, it's like, how do you provide the right, we don't want to overwhelm people with information, obviously. So how do we provide just the right level of information that people don't run away?
Yeah, that will be the challenge for sure.
Yes.
But I like that comment, and I also like the comment I think made by Madison to add some context to the references that we provide as well. I think that'll be useful.
Yes. Yep. Great. All right. Well, our next meeting is next Thursday for this cluster on February 2nd at 1400 Eastern. So yeah, Andrew, it would be great to have you come to that meeting if you're interested, and any others who might be interested. We're going to keep working through this, develop this into, you know, products that we will mostly will share through the ESIP Figshare, and that will be sort of linked to the primer basically. And the intention is to do this first with that one section of the primer, and then go through and do it with the rest of the sections of the primer. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
The only thing I can think of is the 3 takeaways. But
Fair
I
enough.
guess we'll just discuss that outside this, or if there's anything anyone wants to share that they thought was a large takeaway from this session, that'd be great.
Yes, any takeaways that anyone has? I think one takeaway, which maybe is specific, but to add more context to the links, that, you know, providing links just as a link is not enough. So that's one takeaway I have personally from this, which I thought, yeah, it's great. Madison?
Yeah, just maybe one thing is like knowing your audience as data managers, I think is good, but then also making sure that there's specificity in what is included so that when people outside of your audience come, there's not confusion. And I think we did that in some places. But yeah, just maybe just a consideration, like I could probably state that better, but does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think it's hard because, I mean, I think that's why we tried to make our audience so narrow in a way, is that, you know, we don't intend this to be for just anyone to come and just, you know, do this, because that would be a really broad to try to tackle, I think. But yes, trying where we can to make it more clear, for sure, to those who aren't familiar. I think that will help people who are new to working with biological data too. So, okay, great. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your input to this and taking it the next step. So I think we're getting close to having something that's almost ready. So that's really exciting. So we'll keep you updated as we go forward. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of the ESIP meeting. Anything else?
No, I was just going to say great, small, but productive session. I think having everyone in the room worked out really well. And I would just encourage all of you to attend the closing plenary and award ceremony that kicks off in not too long. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and say lovely to see all of you.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.